So the next presentation is Matt Futia? Multi-species interactions with artificial causeways in Lake Champlain. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here today. Hopefully I'll be able to keep you awake after that break. Talking about Lake Champlain here and focusing on how different fish species are interacting with these causeways that separate basins in Lake Champlain. So it's a unique feature. You don't really see this often in freshwater lakes. You think of habitat fragmentation being in rivers and causing all sorts of effects on the movement of those species. So we want to see how these structures are influencing movement in a lake setting. And I say we because I definitely did not do this by myself. A lot of partnership here with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, as well as Lisa Izzo, who's currently at the University of Tennessee, previously in the co-op unit based out of UVM, and then also my postdoc advisor, Ellen Marsden. A lot of other people I want to thank really quick for this. This is an acoustic telemetry project. There's a lot of hands that need to make those types of projects possible. We also have all sorts of different data sets, multiple species, so lots of people who helped out with this. USGS, the Rubenstein Ecosystem Science Lab, and then of course funding from Great Lakes Fishery Commission. A little bit of history about the causeways in Lake Champlain. They were initially built as early as the 1850s to about 1900, and their initial purpose was to connect the mainland to these islands for railway use. And you can see here today, this one's one of the largest causeways in the lake, and there's no longer railings going across it. You can see there's a little bit of an opening right there, so openings were put in later to allow fish and boat passage. And now this is a tourist attraction, it's a bike path, you can get out on the water and really just enjoy the beauty of Lake Champlain. There are 6 causeways throughout the lake to help that transportation. The one that we were just looking at in the figure there, that's the Island Line Causeway here, separating Mallett's Bay from the main lake. And there's also another causeway just north of it. We have the Gut is a small basin in the middle between the 2 islands, and it's got causeways on either side. There's also the Carey Bay Causeway, which is on the western side of that bay, and then Missisquoi Bay Causeway, separating Missisquoi Bay from the rest of the lake. These causeways all have small openings like we saw in that earlier picture, and were typically built in shallow areas. Just to give you an idea of the lengths, we have most of these causeways are over 1 kilometer long. Again, one causeway being approximately 5 kilometers long, and you can see how narrow those openings are. Again, here's that Island Line Causeway. You can see that very small opening. If you're thinking about building a structure in the middle of water, you probably want to do something that's as efficient as possible. So you'd say, okay, well, why isn't that causeway straight, right? That's a lot of extra space to get this rail line going. Well, if you look at the bathymetry of the lake, that follows the bathymetry very nicely. And you can see these are distances to 15 meters depth, and if anything's in bracket, that means that there's no shallow water within 15 meters. It's the closest, or the depth about 1 kilometer away. So you can see that these fish are traveling far distances over shallow water in a lot of these cases to cross these causeways. And the shallow habitat there, that's just a natural feature of the lake. It's not anything that was anthropogenic. So we really want to know, how are these causeways restricting this interbasin fish movement in Lake Champlain? And to address that question, we looked at if and when different fish are crossing causeways. More specifically, we want to determine the frequency, how that varies by species and age, looking at 3 different species. We've got lake sturgeon, walleye, and lake trout. We also wanted to say where, like which causeways are they crossing, and what time of year based on season are they making those crossings. And then also evaluate individual fish behavior. So at the individual scale rather than the population scale, are these fish making these movements multiple times, or is it something that's just a one and done, they're not going to cross again? So as I mentioned at the start, we used acoustic telemetry for this. We had receivers that were placed throughout the lake. Kind of hard to see probably from the figure here, but there's a bunch of blue dots that are a bunch of receiver locations. And then around the causeway openings, we also had receivers. And those ones around the openings were the really critical receivers for this because we could see if a fish was passing through it or not. Receiver coverage around those openings, this is a long study period from 2014 to 2024. You can see that there's some gaps there. The Island Line Causeway here does have 2 openings, There's a southern opening that we did not have receivers on for a good chunk of the study period because it's such a small opening. We weren't expecting fish to go through that. After looking through some preliminary data, it suggested that they might actually be going through that, so that's why we added some receivers there. But for the most part, we were able to show pretty good coverage of those openings. Also want to note that the Missisquoi Bay area had pretty limited receiver coverage. We did have receivers out there at the start of the study. Turns out that they were really hard to get back. And we also had, for the target species at the time, expectations that they were going to be going into Missisquoi Bay. And since then, there has been some receiver coverage, but we're just not going to focus on Missisquoi Bay for the purpose of this talk. And I also just want to point out that the receivers that we're using, we're assuming that they had about 250 meters of detection range, meaning that if a fish swims within 250 meters of that range, there's a good chance that we're going to detect it there. Beyond that, we start to question if we're actually able to detect that fish, so we try to get those receivers as close as possible to those causeway openings. As I mentioned, we targeted 3 different species, starting with lake sturgeon, being a benthic cool water species, and the river spawners during the spring. We tagged 25 juveniles, including 10 females, 15 males. Sex for them was determined genetically, and they had a transmitter that had about a 3 to 5 year battery life. 34 adults, mix of females and males, mostly females though, and they had a much longer battery life, about 10 years. Lake trout, benthic cold water species, they spawn in the lake during fall. For these we tagged about 30 juveniles, no sex data for those individuals, 3 to 5 battery life. 130 females, or adults for the lake trout, 36 females, 41 males. A lot of unknowns for that population. It was just difficult to identify the sex when we were tagging the fish. And again, 3 to 5 years for their tag. And then lastly, walleye, pelagic cool water species, river spawners in spring, no juveniles tagged for the walleye, and a smaller population with only 22 adults tagged. And these numbers represent live fish that were filtered, so we assume that these are all live fish moving around in the lake. We've got multiple periods of movement for all of them. Other fish were tagged as well that were filtered, so this is just the number of fish that we work with for our analyses. Total of 241 fish tracks. Like I said, there's a lot of work here, a lot of assistance from state, Rubenstein Lab. Very appreciative of all that and just being able to work with the data for this fun project. Diving into results. Starting with the frequency by species and maturity, so whether you're juvenile or adult. First takeaway here, most fish had no crossings. So you can see that by all these positions on the bottom here. The violin plots, most of the points are on the bottom, so most fish are not going across these basins. But we also see that all juvenile sturgeon did not make any crossings. LKS here for lake sturgeon, LKT lake trout, WAL for walleye. Looking at the significance now, we see that they were most common, so the letters differentiate the significant differences. The crossings were most common by adult lake sturgeon as well as walleye, and then to a lesser extent by lake trout and as adults and juveniles, and also that the juveniles tended to make crossings less frequently than the adults. Overall, we identified 313 crossings from those 240 individual fish. Next, we want to say, okay, where are these crossings occurring and by which species? The blue indicates bathymetry, and the lighter blue is shallower water, darker blue deeper water, and different arrows correlate to the different species, the frequency of crossings, and also direction. Probably kind of difficult to see those arrows from the back there, and also the stars indicate the locations where those openings are in the causeway. And I'll just pull all these up real quick to dive through the results because it's kind of hard to see it. But most of the results, or most of the crossings you can see are occurring at that island line causeway for the yellow and the red, which indicate the lake sturgeon and lake trout. And you can see those arrows are going in both directions, indicating the fish are going back and forth across that causeway. We also have a lot of other crossings going on at the Sandbar Causeway, and then fewer at that gut, which is, you can see, is a very shallow basin, and then also at Carey Bay up the north part of the passage there. All species crossed pretty much all causeways, except for the gut where we did not have any lake sturgeon going through that area. And then, as I mentioned before, most crossings were bidirectional, meaning that fish are going in both directions, except for the gut, which was largely unidirectional, where fish are going from this large basin on the east side to the west main part of the lake. Looking at the seasonality here, so you can think of this as being January 1st is at the top of the circle here, and then we go day of year all the way around back to the top of the year. The color on the ring represents different seasons: winter, spring, summer, and fall. And then you can see where most of the crossings occurred. So for lake sturgeon here, most of the crossings are occurring in spring. It's kind of what we'd expect for spring spawn, and these fish are moving around a lot during that time of year. Looking at next two species, lake trout, we have a lot of crossings occurring during the spring and the fall, and then for walleye, spring and summer. Lake trout, again, being fall spawners. Cold water obligate, they're going to need to be in the deepest water during the summer, so that's why we're not really seeing any crossings during summer there. Spring, they're actually leaving a lot of areas to get out of those shallower habitats, those shallower basins, to get back to the main lake. Walleye, spring spawners, and so we're seeing a lot of their movements there as well. So we're seeing that these movements, the crossings, are corresponding to preferences from the species as well as the spawning periods. And again, most spawning here is now occurring during the spring across all species. So the last bit here, there's a lot going on in this graph, so try not to get distracted for a second, but this is now looking at the individual behaviors. So each line corresponds to a different fish, and then each mark corresponds to a time that a crossing occurred for that individual. We also looked at things like the directionality. Was it going into the smaller basins or going into the main lake? And then we were looking at which causeway did it occur. So basically we're just looking to see, are there any repeated behaviors here? Are they going back to the same causeway, the same time of year across time? You can see we've got up to 9 years that some of these fish were tagged. So what we found were that fish that crossed once tended to do that again. You can see, for example, the sturgeon here, where there's multiple points. Also, I'll mention that there were only 48 out of 241 fish tagged, so about 20% that accounted for all 313 crossings. So it's, as I mentioned before, it's a rare behavior, but those that do it like to do it often. And we see that there is that seasonal kind of repeating effect. So this sturgeon here is going to the Carey Bay Causeway, so that's in the northern part of the lake. So every year it's going in and out of that basin the same time across years. You can also kind of make out with the lake trout here. They're going out of the smaller basin in the spring, because that smaller basin they're going to have issues with temperature and oxygen availability. But then in the fall after spawning, they're going back into there. And we see that quite often for the lake trout population. And this kind of asks the question, like, okay, are these crossings associated with individual personalities? Are these fish that are more exploratory? They're the ones that have that travel bug. They want to go out and find new places. Or is this something that is more at the population level? And we kind of tease this out because we are seeing, it's a very few number of the population that are making these crossings. So to summarize, causeway crossings are infrequent among species. About 80% of the fish never crossed any of the causeways. And most of these causeways, or most of the crossings occurred at this island line causeway. And again, this was the largest causeway and had relatively smallest size of openings. So it kind of suggests that the fish are able to get through these. You would expect if it was the causeway itself that's limiting the passage, this would be one that you would not expect a lot of crossings to occur at. And it was the most common crossing for both sturgeon and lake trout, and to almost the same extent for the walleye. And we also saw that the crossing probability was influenced by a number of factors: season, correlating to both spawning time, but also the temperature preferences for the fish; maturity, the older fish tended to cross, whereas the juveniles didn't; prior experience kind of related to that, but also thinking about how there's this repeated behavior. When fish do cross into a basin, they go back to that same crossing, that same spot year after year. And then also surrounding bathymetry. Some of those spots, like I mentioned at the gut, there were not very many crossings, but that area is so shallow that something like a lake trout, it's not going to really want to go across that shallow habitat. And then also coming back to personalities. This is something where these fish, the 20% that are crossing causeways, are those the explorers in the population. Think about the plasticity of behaviors in a population. So to conclude, crossings are likely advantageous. These fish that are making crossings do it again and again and again. There's got to be a reason why they want to make those migratory behaviors. But potentially it's impeded by causeways. If it was advantageous, we would expect to see it more commonly than 20% of the population. So one thing that we're thinking about is maybe, like, for example, with the lake trout, they're spawning in fall, but then they're going into these basins during the winter. So maybe there's optimal foraging habitat, optimal prey opportunities in that smaller basin. Also, you might have access to multiple spawning locations. Thinking about the sturgeon, they're stream spawners. They might be going to different streams throughout the different basins. As I mentioned, crossings are more common for adults. Maybe this is a learned behavior, something where over time they're figuring out that there's a benefit to going to those habitats. And then again, relatively low proportion of the tagged fish were observed crossings, and maybe this is a combination of the natural and the anthropogenic factors. There's shallow habitat there. This past year was a really dry year in Lake Champlain. One of the causeways was just the surrounding water body. There was no water, it was just land. There's no fish that's going to get across that. So there's not just these structures, but there's also maybe some underlying factors that are influencing these movements. So that's all I've got for you. There's a lot more to this project. It's now published. If you'd like to see more from the paper, feel free to scan the QR code here. I'll bring you to that link. Or you can contact me by email. If there's time, I'm happy to answer questions.